Hello everyone, thank you for joining us for today's webinar. My name is Eliza Asmelash and I'm from the IRENA Innovation and Technology Center in Bonn. Hopefully most of you are familiar with IRENA, but in case not, we are an intergovernmental organization with 161 members. We support countries in their transition to a sustainable energy future and serve as the principal platform for international cooperation, center of excellence, and repository of policy, technology, resource, and financial knowledge on renewable energy. Our analytical work and our engagement with our member countries generates a lot of valuable insights, and we're constantly looking for more ways to share them. This is why 1 month ago, we launched as a pilot a new fortnightly IRENA Insights webinar program. So every other week, presenters from one of IRENA's team, either alone or together with their invited guests, will share with you the key findings from their latest work. We'll offer you insights into opportunities, trends, best practices, but also innovative solutions to address various challenges. We aim to keep these webinars short, approximately 30 minutes maximum, so we cannot cover everything, but we hope to give you enough to decide whether to delve deeper, and we will signpost further sources of more in-depth information to help you to do that. So today's webinar, Planning for the Renewable Future, Improving the Use and Development of Long-Term Energy Scenarios, will explore the rapidly evolving landscape of long-term energy planning practices. Our speakers will share with you the insights into IRENA's long-term energy scenarios campaign and network, which aims to provide a global platform to exchange good practices in the use and the development of clean energy transition scenarios. They will also speak about IRENA's AVRIL program, which stands for Addressing Variable Renewables in Long-Term Energy Planning, and which aims to support government planning practitioners to adopt practical strategies to represent variable renewable energies in long-term modeling of crucial power system requirements, such as firm capacity, system flexibility, and transmission capacity. Our speakers today are Pablo Carvajal and Bilal Hussein, who are our long-term energy scenarios experts. Their presentation will be approximately 20 minutes to allow 10 minutes session for questions and answers. Before I hand the microphone to Pablo and Bilal, I have few housekeeping items to cover. Today's webinar will be recorded and available together with the presentation slides on IRENA's webinar website. The previous webinar recording and slides are already there. The link will be shared with you in the follow-up email. All of you are currently muted and will remain so throughout the webinar. We would love to hear from you during today's presentation. So if you have any questions for our speakers, please feel free to send them through the question feature that you can find on the webinar panel. We will be monitoring the question throughout the session and select some to be answered by our speakers. Due to time constraints, we apologize in advance if your question is not answered. You may also download the PowerPoint and reports on which this presentation is based in the handouts section. If you experience any technical difficulties, please try to reconnect by dialing in via phone. If you can get the phone number by clicking on the phone option located on the webinar panel. If your technical difficulties remain unsolved, you may write us through the chat section and we will try to help. So without any further ado, let me kick things off by welcoming Pablo and Bilal. Bilal, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Elisa. Hi all, it's Bilal, and thank you very much for joining today's webinar. I will start with a short overview of IRENA's AVRIL project. As Elisa mentioned, that AVRIL stands for Addressing Variable Renewables in Long-Term Planning. I would just go along with this word, variable renewables. We here mean solar and wind generation technologies, and from long-term planning, we mean the typical long-term planning process undertaken by governments across the globe to determine a long-term resource mix, specifically in power systems. They generally use economic assessment models. We generally regard them, or we name them as generation expansion plans. So the project actually started back in 2014 and 15 when IRENA conducted side events during International Energy Workshop with several stakeholders, and it was found out that the important stakeholder in planning renewable energy shares in the long term, the energy planning officials, are sort of stuck in between the two opposing opinions. The first one coming from the system operators that actually see the penetration of renewables in operating the grid, and they find it a bit more challenging to keep the system reliability in some certain cases, and they would favor to have upper limits for VRE penetration in the grids. And on the other side, the policymakers that would be more enthusiastic in promoting VREs, and they would definitely go for adopting ambitious long-term VRE targets for power systems. So in this context, IRENA conducted a comprehensive expert meeting in March 2015, and after a series of interviews with all the stakeholders, we managed to achieve a comprehensive publication in 2017 that was purposed to investigate all the long-term investment implications posed by VREs for power system development plans. And this publication primarily addressed two stakeholders. In the next slide, I will just give you a short overview of how this publication addressed the decision makers. It actually gave a comprehensive account on the unique VRE characteristics and linked the impact of these characteristics on the long-term maintenance of the provisions of important power system properties, which are firm capacity, flexibility, and transmission capacity needs and stability provisions. So these unique VRE characteristics, if we summarize, are the variability of generation that encapsulates the diurnal patterns or seasonal patterns or interannual patterns, then the uncertainty in prediction of VREs, even if it's a 5 minutes forecast, then their location-based constraint and their way to interconnect with the grid through inverter-based technologies. All of these unique properties have specific long-term investment impacts on system properties. And you can see it on the figure in the left side, but on the right side, you can see that when we plot these important properties across the different planning stages that are traditionally executed in government sectors, then we can see the firm capacity has always been a strong target in generation expansion models. And while we go downstream the ladder, more geospatially resolved models are used to determine the transmission capacity needs in the long run, and highly temporally resolved models are used for doing production cost models, modeling of the power systems to determine the dispatch and operational details, and together with the network topology and generation resource mix and these operational details, network studies are undertaken by highly temporally resolved models, which are actually sort of a time snapshot analysis to determine the grid enhancement needs and or other stability enhancement measures in the long term to support the proposed resource mix. So the thing gets unique with planning of variable renewables is that for smaller power systems with the addition of certain level of VREs, all the important system properties need significant investments, even the stability, and therefore it needs a more comprehensive addressing right at the first stage of long-term planning using generation expansion models. So, and when the expansion models are indicating to high shares of variable renewables in the long run, it also becomes important to capture the investments occurring in all these important system properties. So one aspect that publication gave was the relative relevance of these important system investment impacts, which is quite guideful for planning authorities responsible for long-term planning of power systems in government sectors. In this slide, I'll just give you a short overview of how the publication addressed the planning practitioners. It facilitated them with giving practical impact modeling methodologies, gave them information on the parametric assumptions, for example, the flexibility parameters of conventional generation technologies. It gave quite a lot of country-based application examples, information on data sources, and it also gave a comprehensive account on different tools that are available for governments to do long-term planning subject to their own specific objectives, and also a bit of account on pre-processing methodologies, for example, to select the right time slice for the analysis. So in the below figure, you can see the summary of the 9 solutions that the report addresses in detail. So it covers the cross-cutting solution of increasing temporal and spatial resolution, which actually enables to capture all other important investment impacts that come under firm capacity needs or flexibility needs or transmission capacity needs. You can see one more important point in this figure is the relative complexity of incorporating investment implications in system flexibility provision and stability provision. And the main reason for flexibility provisions is the temporally resolved nature, because the flexibility investments are accounting to maybe starting from 1 minute to 60 minutes of ramping needs, and stability constraints, of course, needs high details of network topology and the operational details, and traditionally this is not the strong point of generation expansion plans. So having this publication done in 2017, RENA managed to disseminate the collected knowledge in 3 regional workshops. First of them was conducted in Latin America with the cooperation of Argentina's Ministry of Energy and Mining. And the second workshop happened in Central Asia. We have 5 Central Asian countries represented in the workshop. And the latest one happened in Arab region, where we had 10 Arab countries represented. And in all of these workshops, we had this objective to connect with the like-minded organizations to support the regional dialogue on promotion of renewables, and to engage the government professionals so that their improvement in their planning processes can be harnessed. From the experience gained during these workshops, we managed to achieve 2 more publications which are available on our website, and these publications give a very interesting insights on the planning frameworks used in different countries, the way they approach to represent variable renewables in long-term planning models, and the challenges they are facing. It also entails the information of the country surveys we managed to conduct with the countries, and it includes the information of the tool sets they use to model long-term plans, what are their improvement priorities, so it gives essential insight for other organizations who are working in this domain to promote further with their future activities. Also, these reports have a regional synthesis indicating that who are the front-running countries in terms of long-term modeling, and how the different countries placed in terms of their planning practices maturity status can look forward to the advanced countries globally to improve their planning processes. Just in the last slide, I will give you a short overview of what's the current focus of AVRIL program. We have conducted recently an expert workshop in December in Bonn, where we addressed the geospatial modeling aspects of variable renewables, and we are in the stage of developing a short spin-off report addressing these issues. And other than that, the most important issues that are arising over time are to the representation of demand-side innovations in long-term models, and to represent the VRE stochastics, which seems to be pretty interesting for all of our member states. And on the regional workshop agenda, we have already charted down the important follow-up areas to engage deeper into with our member states. So we are planning to have regional workshops for Latin America and Arab regions, and we're also planning to have further workshops for South Asia and Central Asia. And with that, I wrap up the part on AVRIL program. I would just hand over the floor to my colleague Pablo to have a more insight on the long-term energy scenarios campaign of IRENA. Thank you.
Hello to all. I would like to present to you the LTES network, which is a platform for the promotion of effective use of long-term energy scenarios, LTES, for the clean energy transition. The LTES network from IRENA launched in April 2019, and it's open to all countries and technical institutions that are seeking to exchange experience and good practice in the use of long-term energy scenarios to guide decision-making in the energy transition. This LTES network stemmed from an initial LTES campaign that was launched in May 2018 under the Clean Energy Ministerial Workstream. Initially, we had 12 member countries and 7 technical partners that got together and decided to share the experience they had regarding model-based scenarios for the long term for the energy system. Now, diving in the purpose and the motivation and the focus areas of this work on LTES, long-term energy scenarios by IRENA, I would like to share first the mental model used for scenario use and development. So energy modeling tools are commonly used as a tool to produce long-term energy scenarios, which themselves are used for long-term energy policy making. And along this chain of using models to produce scenarios and to inform policymaking, we have stakeholder consultations where different actors involved in society participate in each of these processes. So in the energy modeling tools, usually this becomes an academic exercise. Universities are very familiar with the use of modeling tools. Government as well and technical institutions use different modeling tools to assess supply, demand, or supply and demand with different approaches and different types of models. Long-term energy scenarios, on the other hand, are based on narratives and political drivers that present objectives of the country's energy or electricity or power sector policy. And long-term energy policy making, ultimately, scenarios are transformed into statements that are binding or non-binding that guide a country's development. So in these campaigns and the LTES network and this campaign of LTES as well, we have 3 focus areas that we're looking into. The first one is strengthening the development of LTES, long-term energy scenarios. And the key question that we want to address there is how can scenarios be developed to better account for potentially transformational changes? We know that the energy transition is like nothing ever before, and it's very fast with many innovations and technology developments. So models need to be in the capacity to expand and their boundaries to capture these characteristics that are unique from the transition that we're living. The second focus area is improving the use of long-term energy scenarios. The key question there is how can scenarios be better used for strategic decision-making by governments and investors? Now here I want to make a distinction. People developing long-term energy scenarios are not necessarily the ones using them for decision-making. So we want to make this clear distinction in IRENA and be a bridge from the modeling community, which is developing scenarios, to the actual users, which are the policymakers and governments. And there we have many insights to share about how to use the scenario, insights and results. And lastly, a focus area from our LTES network and campaign is building capacity, but not as building capacity in itself, but looking into how or what approaches can enhance institutional capacity for scenario planning. So what is the best way, or what are the ways in which governments around the world are implementing scenario building capacity? So after the activities that we've held with the LTES campaign and network, the discussions held in workshops, in events, in side events, and conferences, we've come up with 5 key recommendations for improved development of LTES, use of LTES, and capacity for LTES. Regarding the development of LTES, we have two points we want to make there. The first one is to establish a strong governance structure for the scenario development process. It has been shown that improved coordination between the entities producing scenarios is beneficial to drive a consensus and to move forward on planning. Second, expand the boundaries of the scenarios being developed. The tools and the models developed 20, 30 years ago did not think of innovations and technological advancement that we're seeing today. So we need to expand the boundaries of the tools used and the scenarios to explore the possibilities for the long term. Regarding the use of LTES, recommendations for improved use of scenarios are to firstly clearly convey the purpose of the scenarios one builds and use. We have discovered that there is different types of scenarios, and when somebody mentions the word scenario, we might not be all referring to the same thing. In this sense, we have scenarios that are used for exploratory purposes, which fall in the realm of academia. And we also have scenarios that are more conservative, which are more tight in their assumptions and more conservative in the ways they assume technological change. These types of scenarios are usually used by transmission operators who are planning expansion of their capacity in the midterm. Another point for improved use of LTES is to be transparent and to explore effective scenario communication methods. Some countries have been exploring ways to showcase the results in a simple way for the wider audience, beyond the policymakers that are using the scenarios. Being transparent not only in the results is important, but also in the whole chain of developing and using scenarios. Having open sources for assumptions and narratives and the data used for the models allows for cross-checking and stress testing the scenarios developed with what models. Lastly, in the capacity for LTES, how to have improved capacity, we understand that the key recommendation there is to build the right type of scenario capacity within governments, which are the ultimate bodies making decisions regarding long-term developments for the country. So as an example for this last point regarding where to build capacity for long-term energy scenario, where is scenario capacity allocated and developed? And we find that there are various ways of managing national scenario capacity countries. So as you can see in this figure, you can see that there are countries that go about capacity and scenario allocation in source. So they put capacity to develop scenarios within government walls. And you can see below a bar of the LTES campaign members and how these countries allocate capacity. There's the other extreme to the right, which is outsourcing the scenario capacity. Here you can outsource the scenario capacity mostly to consultancies or totally to technical institutions. But there's also the middle ground in which government has a specific or a delegated technical institution or agency which purposes to provide scenario development for government decision making. So we have a broad band of places where scenario capacity can be allocated, and there is no right or wrong way. Simply it's depending on the country, how the country wants to organize its scenario building and use process. However, diving a bit deeper on this topic, we know that we have found that there are key success factors depending on what type of allocation a country decides to go for. Does it want to insource or outsource? When it decides to insource, what is paramount is the quality assurance. For example, engaging with academia can help build models and scenarios that have good quality assurance. Second, if you decide to insource, there needs to be a team or agency dedicated to modeling and scenario building, which is within government walls. And finally, if you decide to insource, there needs to be an institutional process for regular updates of the long-term energy scenarios and their assumptions. However, there is the option, of course, to outsource, which is also a possibility. But if it is decided to outsource, it is important to have absorptive capacity within government to understand the modeling results. So that means that regardless of if the scenario building process is taking within or without government, there has to be a team that can at least understand the conditions, the modeling, the tools, the assumptions, and the narratives, and the results presented by consultants. Another key success factor when you outsource modeling capacity or scenario building capacity is to have full disclosure of scenario data and modeling methodology. We want to avoid the black box issues that appear when one hires a consultant, the consultant leaves, and he or she leaves with the model and the way to produce more scenario results. So full disclosure from the beginning is paramount when one outsources scenario development capacity. And finally, a key success factor when it is decided to outsource is to access to enough high quality research institutions. So in the measure that there is capacity to model scenarios outside of government, you can outsource. So It is beneficial to have several academic institutions and also several consultancies to take the challenge. And in this case, government can take a role of comparing and benchmarking different scenarios and assumptions from different results from consultancies or academia. I just want to announce an upcoming event. We have the IRENA Second International Forum on Long-Term Energy Scenarios for the Clean Energy Transition. This is an international gathering of experts who are either using or developing long-term energy scenarios to support policymaking and planning for the clean energy transition. The discussion topics will be electrification scenarios for a carbon neutral energy system, incorporating economic and financial risks of the clean energy transition and scenarios, representing systemic innovation and energy demand and consumer behavior in scenarios, stakeholder engagement in the scenario process for just transition, and other topics, all revolving around the issue of long-term energy scenarios. This event will be back-to-back with the Berlin Energy Transition Dialogue from the 25th to 27th of March in Berlin, Germany. To register, you can send an email to ltes@irena.org, or you can Google Second International Forum, and you will be directed to the registration page.
Thank you, Pablo and Bilal, for a very insightful presentation. Let me go directly to the questions. We have already received several ones. Thank you for them. Let me start with this one. How to include the small off-grid renewable energy systems in national long-term energy plans?
Okay, I'll just start and add in some points here. Actually, this topic was discussed at length during our December workshop on geospatial modeling. There are several important factors when we are planning off-grid renewable energy. Firstly, it requires a very high depth of geospatial capabilities of the models. And secondly, it's not traditionally done in government sectors. We have seen approaches conducted by regional institutes with their developed models, which are sometimes in open source landscape as well. It depends on having a soft linkage. We can have results from generation expansion models feeding into the details about the grid-based electricity price and into the models that explore the potential for off-grid renewable energy deployment. But then there are cross-linkages. The off-grid renewable deployment can have impact on the demand that is modeled in long-term generation models, and therefore there can be a shift in the outputs of both models depending on the impacts from each others. There has been more challenges in endogenizing somehow to make one model that plans for central electricity grid as well as for off-grid renewables. But efforts are on way, and mostly it lies in the research grade. But soft linkage technique seems to be a practical approach today. Maybe Pablo would like to add some points if. Oh, yeah. Let me read. It's about to include the modeling of off-grid renewable electricity in central planning.
Yes, as I had mentioned in my presentation, long-term energy scenario models are not usually capable of capturing the off-grid aspect or the electrification aspect in their code or in their optimization or simulation process. Therefore, I agree with Bilal that the best way is to use an exogenous model, so a second model, to assess the deployment of off-grid electrification or different types of isolated systems. And those findings of how much capacity would be needed deployed can be represented as a plant or a unit or as a demand in the long-term energy system model. Now, the drawback of using second party models for electrification is that usually models designed for electrification are static in time. So you can only design a system generally for one snapshot in time, and they don't do capacity expansion as a long-term energy system model does. So these things need to be assessed, probably modeling the expansion of the off-grid system in time, in different time or milestones that can be fed into the long-term energy system model at the different time steps. So that would be the technical aspect of how to approach it. And then the geospatial aspect as well. Long-term energy system models in general do not capture the geospatial aspect. What modelers do is represent different nodes to represent the bottlenecks of the transmission system and somehow capture where the generation and the demand centers are in the energy system model. So, but geospatial analysis for the electrification aspect goes beyond that. So there's a need to model this exogenously to capture where transmission needs to extend it, or where the trade-off between isolated system and transmission extension can happen. Now, there's some efforts in modeling this endogenously. This means including all these factors to determine whether you should extend the grid or implement an offline or an off-grid system. But they are mostly still in technical institutions and not commercially available. That's what I could say.
Yes, yes.
Thank you, Pablo and Bilal. Let me take another question. To implement renewable energy, do we require financial modeling to be covered beyond total life cycle costs?
Yes, this is a very interesting question. Thank you very much, Elisa, for this question, and the attendee who stated it. This is a matter of time horizons. Of course, long-term energy system models, we're talking about 30, 40, 50 years in the future. And this, of course, goes beyond the financial or the economic lifetime of a renewable energy project, except nuclear or hydro, I would say. So in average, you have that a lifetime of a PV farm or a wind farm is between 15 and 20 years. And after this time, what happens? So, of course, any project of renewable has to undergo a pre-feasibility, a feasibility, and then a due diligence process to assess the bankability of the project, which will determine if it is profitable or not. However, long-term energy scenarios and models have a different approach. They assess the value of the whole energy system and the optimum for the whole system and not for a particular project. Therefore, financial modeling can be used, and what is interesting about the financial modeling is that we can obtain maybe the decommissioning values or the salvage values or the overhaul values needed to revamp that plant, and that can be included as data for a long-term energy system model. So the energy system model can take into consideration the economic lifetime of the project, that is the cost per megawatt installed and versus the energy produced. And at the end of the life cycle, the energy model can decide to decommission it, salvage it, or overhaul it, depending on the optimum of the entire system. So financial modeling is a process that will have to be done hand by hand with long-term energy scenarios. May I say that also financial modeling is the one that provides the LCOE, the levelized cost of energy, for the technologies that we have and that we are using in long-term energy scenarios, especially for optimization models. So it is a matter to do hand by hand if you have the data at the project level in your country.
Thank you, Pablo. We're slowly running out of time, but I'll just ask another question. How to model standalone battery technology and municipal waste energy technologies?
Starting with the last one first, the waste energy technologies, modeling them is almost similar to modeling any conventional plant in long-term generation expansion models. It though requires more research on the supply chain side to determine the capacity factors of such plants. The seasonal variation of supply chain can impact their production and their value accordingly, but it doesn't require much of an upgrade within the generation expansion models that we have at the moment. About representing the batteries, the models have a limited capability mostly to represent battery storage, but it's almost in the middle of some capabilities we have in the models, but battery is providing so many services in different temporal domains that not all of them are fully represented even in the high research grade generation expansion models. For example, the batteries can provide services in the domain of regulation, in the domain of contingency reserve, starting from 5 minutes to maybe 45 minutes. But the temporal resolution for even the state-of-the-art generation expansion models generally are not below 1 hour. And most of the time we have representative time slices that represent the whole year of optimization. So it's quite a deal in the research field to model batteries, but some capabilities do exist in top-notch models that are used by advanced planning utilities.
Thank you, Bilal. I think we have time to ask two more questions. What are the key criteria for the policymakers, especially in developing countries, to choose between open source and commercial tools for long-term planning modeling?
Thank you for this question. I would like to take that if my colleagues allow.
Yeah, please.
This is an issue of that is of relevance not only for developing countries, but also for developed countries that have the possibility of using commercial licensed software. The question is, of course, should we use open source or commercial tools? There are things to look at, and there's a trade-off in each way you go. If you have the financial means to use a commercial model or tool, commercial models usually provide a better consumer experience, and they have broader support for the user. So if something doesn't work, you are free to call the service center and ask why it doesn't work, and you will get feedback quick, and they will probably help you solve the impasse that you have with your modeling. Whereas if you use open source, the consumer support is rather not that broad, and you would need to rely on the forums. We have, of course, the possibility of using open source or non-commercial tools, but in that case, the ones that are using more open source tools are the academia, especially. So they have the time and the possibilities to dive into the forums and to the articles, journal articles, where much of the developments of open source is happening. However, as I said, since the commercial tools have more means and more financial means, they're also being used to model more advanced technologies and have more acceptance within decision makers that are using more advanced tools. Open source models are catching up, of course, but as I said, it's based on the users and the fora that are using the models to do the enhancements and improvements to the models.
Thank you, Pablo, for answering this question. There is another question. I'm currently implementing behavioral aspects for the transport energy sector. And I'd like to know or to be pointed to sources on ways of endogenizing consumer behavior in long-term power system modeling.
So the endogenization, thank you for this question. The energy system model has a supply side and general aspects and the demand side. There are tools that only model or produce scenarios for the supply side. There are also tools which are usually more in the economic spaces that help you model the demand side. But there are also tools that model in one single model, both supply and demand, and allow to endogenously model demand. This is the use of energy within the same model that will provide the supply. Now, regarding this, if there are people in the audience that want to dive into endogenous modeling of demand, the first thing is to make sure that you have the data available at the consumer level. This means at the end use level of energy consumption. This helps to model not energy as the black box or as a number, but actually actual energy consumption happening in the appliances and in each sector. So for industry, it's good to have the sub-industrial or the subsector demand of energy and what machinery is using energy and where the efficiency can happen. In the transport sector, which is related to the question, it is necessary to have data at the level of passenger kilometer or ton kilometer according to the modes of transport. This will help, of course, to model endogenously in the model how demand can evolve in the future. Nonetheless, this is an area that is still growing and still is in research. It falls in the area of behavioral economics, because the way the energy system optimization models work in particular are regarding neoclassical economics of balance of supply and demand. And consumer behavior doesn't necessarily obey traditional economics. Consumers make decisions by different drivers. So the uptake of vehicles or the uptake of heat pumps or the uptake, not even that, but of hydrogen and other technology will depend on the vested interests of consumers and decision makers in the overall economy. This is an ongoing field of research, but behavioral economics is the way to go to assess how the transition is happening on the demand side.
Thank you, Pablo, and thank you, Bilal. Unfortunately, time is up. So many insightful questions to choose from. Let me thank today's speaker for their captivating presentation and the audience for the very pertinent questions we received. We hope that the insights of our colleagues shared are of great value to all of you. A couple of final announcements. To be able to reflect on the delivery of our webinar and ways to improve it, we would appreciate your feedback. We would like to invite you to complete a very short satisfactory survey, which will appear at the end of the webinar and which will be shared with you in the follow-up email. Thank you in advance. And last but not least, we would like to invite you all to our next edition of this webinar series on the innovations needed for 100% renewable power and the need for a systemic approach. It will take place in 2 weeks from now on Tuesday, 17th March 2020 at 10 a.m. CET. You can already register on the IRENA website, and the link will be again shared with you in our follow-up email. Once again, we thank you all for attending this webinar session. Goodbye and see you soon.
Thank you all.